Okay, on that note, actually, let's go ahead and talk about Squall, because he is clearly the main protagonist of this game, around which all the party members sort of hinge. He progresses to become the leader quite quickly. And on a general note of Squall, I think during concepting and early in development, there must have been a very real concern about distinguishing this new protagonist from Cloud, from Final Fantasy VII. And I feel personally that this was very well achieved, right down to the aesthetics, the attitude, and of course the trademark weapon of Squall. I think the gunblade is a very cool concept, and I'm not sure where else they could have gone, because of course the protagonist's weapon is almost as significant as the protagonist himself in a lot of ways. And after creating something as iconic as the Buster Sword, I find it very interesting about where they could have potentially gone with that. But I think the gunblade certainly stands out because in this quasi steampunk futuristic universe that fuses sorceresses and sort of this feudal European sort of history with the undertones of the overtones, I should say, of profound technological advancement, blending a sword with a gun, it kind of crystallizes, in a sense, the sort of universe that we're operating in. So it does make for a very good, iconic protagonist weapon. The characterization of Squall, right down to his name, is also very interesting. I mean, if we consider his inner turmoil and look at the etymology of his name, Squall, which is of course a storm at sea, this is like a metaphorical label, if you like. His name is a label for the turbulent nature of his psyche, his inner self. But I also find this doubly interesting when contrasting Squall with Seifer, for example, who he shares a very interesting symbiotic sort of relationship with that I'll go on to talk about later. And basically, we note of Seifer that he utilises fire elements all through this game, thus is a binary opposition to the water element that Squall is of course associated with by his name. And also on this note, and this is what drives home the fact that this was very deliberate on Square's part, is it's interesting to note that Seifer's friends, Reijin and Fujin, are named after the earth and wind gods of Japanese Shinto mythology. So through this subtle congregation of nature's four elements, we can see Squall as water has been aligned against the other three key elements, and this sort of further emphasizes his individuality and his isolation, I suppose, from everything else. I also think water is the most fitting element for Squall, particularly posited against the impulsive fire symbolism of Seifer, because in the Daoist notion of water is its malleability, and to quote a Bruce Lee, yeah, I think it was actually Bruce Lee that said this, but if you put water in a cup, it becomes the cup. And it's this malleable nature of water, and I think this defines Squall conforming to the position of leadership, conforming to people, and gradually by the end of this game conforming to the world at large. So it's a very fitting metaphor and a great character, very subtle but a very great characterization in my opinion. So let's talk about Squall's attitude, because it's a definitive aspect of his character and a defining plot point of the game. Now, first of all, I think Squall. My opinion of Squall was definitely tarnished by the rise of the idea of the emo in the mid 2000s, and this whole emo thing sort of commodified and made a joke out of formative adolescent issues, and adolescent attitudes, that people have when they go through that period of their life. And Squall kind of genuinely has these and embodies these quite realistically. But rather than being, depressed and, sort of conventionally emo as a sort of as a persona, as a commodity that a lot of fans now accuse Squall of, and they don't like him because of it. Squall's whole attitude actually stems from a very acute and quite realistic childhood abandonment issue. And taking into account that Squall is an orphan who has probably spent the majority of his young life in care. And during the flashbacks, we find him already aloof as a result of what we can probably assume is the death of his parents during the Sorceress War. It's doubly tragic that in his most formative years as, this growing orphan, the most important person to him, who is alone, who is sort of this pillar for him, this sort of emotional, pillar of strength, is taken away from him or leaves him behind. And this speaks volumes in my eyes and totally rationalises why we find Squall so emotionally blunted and aloof as we do at the beginning of the game. In fact, there is a psychological idea put forward by a British psychologist called John Bowlby, and he identifies an extreme reaction to childhood abandonment can be what's called defensive detachment. And this basically involves individuals attempting to remain completely independent of all relationships and all other people, never risking meaningful attachment again for fear of, again, recurring abandonment. So I think, this is a very pointed and accurate psychological disposition of perhaps how Squall is for a lot of the game, and why on the surface at least he comes across as a almost narcissistically self-involved sort of person. I feel this was exceptionally important though, and I can understand why people don't like Squall at the beginning of the game, and understandably, I mean, I don't really like Squall at the beginning of the game, but it was so important to make him this extreme in terms of his being segregated from people, because it allowed for the theme of togetherness and the theme of the existential self to be explored and developed, that much more, because he's such, so far on this extreme. By disc 3 we see this massive amount of development in him, and I feel it was a massive success on the part of the writers to create such a compelling plot with him and Rinoa. I mean, if you actually recall the beginning of disc 3 where Rinoa falls into a coma, you are at the orphanage with Sid and Adir, and they're basically relaying a lot of plot information to you, such as, this is where we discover who Ultimecia is, this is where we first hear the name Ultimecia, and this is where we first hear the concept of time compression. And simultaneously, while they're telling us this information, we can see, of course, Squall's thoughts. And Squall's thoughts are completely wandering about Rinoa. And this is important because not only is it, a plot development point where we find out about the antagonist, but it also shows how Squall's emotional disposition has so thoroughly shifted onto another person rather than himself, to the extent that, Squall, who was formerly, the A-star pragmatic soldier mercenary student, is ignoring a mission briefing to think about someone else. Lastly, I think it's just important to drive home and note that Squall is not a depressed person from a psychological standpoint. A lot of people say he's whiny and depressed and just a moany teenager, but this actually isn't really the case. He's walled himself up inside a cocoon of self as a defence mechanism, but he's not depressed. He's in fact a remarkably pragmatic and logical person that teeters sometimes into anxiety when he's not sure of what course of action to take, but he's not depressed. So I think I just want to sort of liberate him from that horrible stereotype that people have sort of thrown onto him.